Okay, I'm Winston, and I'm based in the business school. Speaking of evaluation, this paper started out as a challenge. It had to be, we wanted something that was both refable and fun to write. So I was sitting with my friend Panos at a conference on a Greek island once, and we were wondering, what do we like to do? What's fun? He said, well, we like to drink wine. Okay, well, let's do a paper on wine. So what started out as a simple conference paper on wine ended up something short of the sociology of wine. So I thought, this is part of what we've been working on for the last while. You probably can't read this, it's too fuzzy, but this is WSET, which is the Wine and Spirit Educational Trust. That's the official body in the UK that accredits experts, sommeliers, and everyone in between in terms of wine and spirit. Now, you can't probably see, but this is basically a codified way of evaluating wines and spirits. In particular wines, bouquet, the nose of the wine, the appearance of the wine, the viscosity of it, and and then it translates into tasting notes. And then it becomes, Robert Parker does 100 points. Places like Decanter, they do 20-point scale. But you will find this pretty much everywhere in the world. It's a codified way of evaluating wine. How did that come about? Well, if we step back, there's something in France called the AOC. Now, you can see it's actually began in 1935. The first AOC, designated AOC was actually a region in France called Côte de Rhône. And basically it tells you exactly what quantities are permitted, what varieties, and the methods you can use to make the wine. And then, of course, each AOC has their own tasting committee. And they do some objective criteria, volatile acidity, alcohol content, but there's actually a big clause, it's called the but, non-typicity. It means it doesn't accurately reflect the style. And so a great deal of wines can actually be rejected on that basis. So there's quite a mechanism to force adherence to the AOC system. For instance, even the labeling laws. Like this is just, characters no more than half the height of the ones used for the village name, except in the case of, say, Premier Cru and above. Now, why is the AOC important? Well, if you think about it, 53% of all wines, as of, I think, 2011, were produced in France were part of the AOC. Now, if you want any wine for export, any wine that's basically marketable, anything above vin de table, table wines, has to be in the AOC. So you can see that there's a huge incentive to be part of it. But that's exactly part of the complaint. AOC has become an economic tool instead of a safeguard of our terroir. Okay, well, we understand what economic tools are, but what is terroir? You can think of it almost as if you look at different philosophies of winemaking around the world, in France, this is the core of the philosophy. And it's this notion that different soils and different climates, the physicality, the physical characteristics of the different soil and different climate are automatically, and this is another important point, uncritically transferred to the wine itself. Okay, now the French take great pains to play up this idea, but of course it's not just that. It's often portrayed as that, but there's, as Language talks about, he says it's actually strongly related to history, class, and pedigree. So there's this notion of what came before in that land. What was the reputation of the wines that have been grown on that piece of property? So the question is, how did the AOC become an economic tool? Different case studies require you to go a little bit farther back in time. So in the case of this case study, we go back 60 million years to basically, there was the, before you had Laurasia, it was one giant continent, Europe and Asia. Now, 60 million years ago, there was only one species of grape, Latin name, Vitis. Now, due to continental drift, you basically had a number, and also subsequent ice ages, you had the Vitis split into quite a few different varieties. So in Asia, you have numerous varieties. In the Americas, especially with the ice ages, you have a huge proliferation of different species of Vitis, or grapevine. Except in Europe. In Europe, there's only one species. It's called Vitis vinifera, otherwise known as the common grape, or the common grapevine. And it survived in the area of the Transcaucasus, and eventually became the basis. That one species became the basis for all that we know today as wine. Now, what happened is by the 16th century, of course, you have European settlers. Now, what did European settlers in the Americas? Now, one of the things they wanted to do was replicate their practices of winemaking in the New World. So what did they do? Well, they brought over vines with them. But there was one problem. Every time, especially on the east coast of the Americas, they tried to plant their European vines, the Vitis vinifera, they'd find that they'd only last for about 2 or 3 seasons. By about the second season, the vines would start to get yellow, and by the 3rd season, they were almost always dead. So it came to be known that for some reason you could not plant the European grapevine, the Vitis vinifera, in the Americas. However, there was one unexpected side effect that they did not realize. These European vines actually cross-pollinated with some of the local vines. Now you have to understand, the Americas were, even the Vikings called the Americas Vinland because of all the different vines that they saw, the grapevines they saw. Unfortunately, the grapevines of the Americas are not suitable for making wine as we know it today. I'll get into that in a bit. Now, 19th century, the Europeans now have discovered all these very interesting and very hardy ornamental varieties of grapes. The very grapes that were the accidental hybrids of the first attempts to plant the European grape, the Vitis vinifera, in the Americas. So actually there started to be a trade in the 19th century of, you had botanists, you had wine growers that were interested in examining, studying, experimenting with these new varieties of grapes. Why? Because they looked really good. They were beautiful in terms of being ornamental grapes because they looked much nicer than the Vitis vinifera in terms of physical appearance. They still couldn't produce very good wine, but they wanted to play around and experiment with these vines. So you had a trade going on, and that worked fine. And by, of course, the mid-19th century, you had faster steamships. You had things like better designed propellers. You had something designed by Dr. Ward called the Wardian case. Now, this is an interesting thing. It's a terrarium that was sealed on deck, and thus you could actually have whole plants transported from Europe to the Americas and back and forth. The Wardian case was also used, for instance, to establish, to transport and establish opium plantations. It was used to transport orchids from the Brazilian rainforests and bring them to London. Among other things, it was also used to transport tea plants from China to the Assam region in India. And it also, crucially, allowed the rooted American vines to actually make it across the Atlantic. So instead of taking cuttings, they could take plants that were already rooted. And that's where the trouble happened. A Monsieur Rorty of the village Roquemar in the Côte d'Aron, which is in the eastern part of France, he was actually corresponding with another vine grower in New York, Mr. Carl, And he brought back, I think it was in the about 1867 or 65, he brought back a case of rooted vines. And within 3-4 years, basically all the vines, this is what you'd call, Roquemar is actually ground zero. All the vines were devastated. They turned black, and over the course of 2 or 3 seasons, they all died. So actually, this was an interesting product of a transatlantic collaboration. A botanist, Professor Planchon, and Charles Valentine Riley, an American entomologist. And they actually, through a great deal of collaboration, they actually concluded that the aphid actually had come from the Americas. Now, it's interesting also, this was partially due to the fact that Planchon was also fluent in English. He actually served as an apprentice at Kew Gardens, and he was in regular correspondence with Charles Darwin. So through those different contexts, they came to the conclusion that actually this was the same insect, but that the European vine did not have resistance to the insect because in the way that the American vines did, because the American vines had co-evolved with the phylloxera, or the Phylloxera vastastrix. Of course, there was a great deal of controversy. So what happened? What did they have to do? Well, what you saw in Roquemar, in the Côte d'Aron, over the course of the next 10, 20 years. In fact, I think it's called the 30-Year War. Some wine historians call it the 30-Year War. But if you can imagine, by the late 1800s, 1878 to 1879, they actually had to import wine. This is actually during the French Industrial Revolution, so to speak, as well. So you had large numbers of workers in the city that wanted to drink ever more wine. And with 8 million unemployed rural workers. So anyways, so what they did, they tried all sorts of things. They tried different types of insecticides. This is bisulfide. Unfortunately, bisulfide is highly flammable and highly toxic. So it had the unfortunate side effect of sometimes blowing the people up that were actually employing the insecticide. It was quite expensive. They also tried flooding the fields, but that was only a temporary cure. It only cleared the fields for perhaps 1 year, and the phylloxera would come back. But during this period, they actually tried. They said, okay, well, you have phylloxera-free zones. So for example, the Champagne region was one of the last to field phylloxera. The authorities could just go in and completely raze the vineyard or do anything they saw fit. And then in the second zone, they said, okay, you're not allowed alien vines. Now, what do they mean by alien vines? American vines. Because it was the American vines and the aphids that hitchhiked on the roots that were the cause of all the problems. And then in the third zone, these were places that were completely compromised or invaded by phylloxera. They actually allowed the importation and implantation of these American vines. Now, this is where the story now takes a turn, because they find that flooding, insecticides, none of these treatments worked. In fact, it actually came down to a number of families, small family growers, that finally discovered what to do. Now, the idea of grafting, historically, there's a long history of grafting, particularly with fruit trees. It was first small growers in the Burgundy that realized that you could actually take the American vine and as rootstock and plant the European vine, the Vitis vinifera, on top of that and create a viable plant. Now, but there was only one problem. It only worked in some regions. A lot of France has what they call a chalky alkaline soil. Midi is sort of, I believe it's a French term that just kind of means the south or outside. It's kind of, especially when people in Paris say the Midi, it means there, out there, the provinces, down. But But the problem is that much of the soil and much of the wine growing areas is like that. So actually, initially when they used wild American varieties as rootstock, it wouldn't take hold. So what happened was another probably 20 years of research in identifying which wild American rootstocks were suitable for which regions with which varieties, whether it's Chardonnay or Tempranillo or Merlot. Okay, there's no Tempranillo in France, but... and also, in other areas still, they actually had to develop hybrids themselves. So it was hybrids of European and American vines to create a viable rootstock that was reasonably phylloxera resistant that could survive in other different soil and climate conditions. Now, this was actually, just for your information, this is quite interesting. I was looking up inflated and adjusted figures for the effort to reconstitute all of France. And it amounted to something on the order of, I could be wrong, but something like double what the American government spent on the TARP program to recapitalize the banks. So you can imagine how massive an economic upheaval this was for the French. Now, there's another thing they tried to contain. Prior to the depths of the phylloxera crisis, one of the things that they were complaining about, one of the big arguments was that there was too much heterogeneity in the world of winemaking. They said it was chaos. Everybody had their different means of doing wine. And what was interesting is that because all the vineyards were essentially wiped out, or many of the vineyards were wiped out, or were in the course of being destroyed, this gave the excuse to do what's called ensafagement. My French is terrible. But basically it's saying what varieties of vine are permitted in what districts and can be used under what sort of processes to produce certain varieties of wine. And of course, part of it was not only the suitability of what was able to grow in these new rootstock grafts, but also there was lobbying involved. And so you actually had the nature of certain regions change. For instance, I think there was Sancerre, for example. Sancerre was formerly mainly Pinot Noir, which is what you see in Burgundy. And it was converted completely over to Sauvignon Blanc. So when you think of terroir, it's sort of what you could almost think of it as an idealized version of history, of tradition. Okay? And so what happened was it reduced heterogeneity and turned this idea of tradition and wine into a much neater, codified system. Of course, what happened? Okay, you have a massive spike in the market price of wine because much of French production was destroyed. I think up to 80, at the height of the crisis, 80% of all French vineyards were actually destroyed. Of course, what happened though was that this allowed a lot of adulterers, or what they do, they made these wines made from sugar. Sometimes they take black currants and make wine out of it. Sometimes they take the lees, the residue of crushed grapes, and they use it again to make wine. Or they take existing wines, add more sugar, whatever it was. They created all these adulterated wines. And so anyways, what happened was it actually led to insurrection. In fact, in 1907, there was a revolt in Narbonne where the French military actually had to be called in to put it down. So anyways, they redefined wine as the exclusive product of alcoholic fermentation of the fresh grape or the juice of the fresh grape. So wine was defined officially in statute. But the problem here was that the growers actually preferred hybrids. Now, hybrids had a problem. Hybrids produced a wine that is, how to describe it? If you take an American grape and you essentially grape juice, like a Concord or a Clinton, and you try to make wine from it, some people say it's like raspberry juice. Now that's more charitable. Others say it's like, was it Pissat or fox piss? Now what does fox piss taste like or smell like? Well, I'm told, I haven't had any, but I'm told it reminds people of the bouquet of wet dog. Okay. But, it's an acquired taste. They liked all the advantages of it. But eventually, and as part of the AOC rules, these things were banned and eventually legislated out of existence to the point where you cannot commercially sell hybrid wines anywhere in the EU. I mean, this idea of impurity is very interesting. I mean, Roland Barthes talks about it, about wine being the blood of France. And of course, what was interesting is that you had all these, because not only did you have a proliferation of foreign vines, of hybrid vines, of adulterated wines, you also had a proliferation of imported wines. I mean, the phylloxera crisis was also one of the things that really drove production in the New World. Places like South Africa, Algeria, the Americas, Australia, all had minor industries until the phylloxera crisis, and the French started importing wines from there. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that once all the French vineyards were actually reconstituted, the reconstituted vines produced much higher yields than the previous pure Vitis vinifera plants. So what resulted from that was actually a surplus, a glut of wine, and that caused the collapse. So when the phylloxera epidemic then spread to places like Italy, France, Portugal, that was during a period of historically low wine prices. As a result, many of those regions were delayed by decades in reconstituting their vineyard. And that's what allowed, and that's one of the main reasons how the French were actually able to drive their template, their definition of what wine was. Because they were actually able to reconstitute among all the European countries. They were one of the countries that were able to reconstitute while it was still economically viable to do so. So as a result, a lot of the things we see in the AOC are what we recognize as wine today. Oh, by the way, anyone care to guess what this is, where this is from? I call this second-order semiotics, but where would you guess this wine is from? Not Virginia, possibly. Some other people say Australia. Merlot is a French variety. What's interesting is you can't read it, but it says it's actually from Bulgaria, and it's called Domaine Boyar. I call this an interesting example of second-order semiotics. So it's Bulgarian wine that pretends to be a New World wine, which itself has Merlot as a French variety and called itself Domaine Boyar. Okay. This is an example of a graft. So what came out of this was this realization that the ability to reconstitute through grafting, essentially you've created this social, biological, technological network that in itself has affordances and therefore new possibilities in terms of agency. The other is this idea of classification, which then is the basis for ranking, as being the convergence of all these strategies for containment. You try to contain the insect, then you try to contain the soil, which has a consequence of arresting biological evolution in a sense. You try to contain the impurity. You try to contain the fakes. You try to contain the foreign vines. The last thing then is this idea of, so these systems, so in this case, the AOC, it's portrayed as a system of, or as a means of stewardship. We are protecting tradition. We are protecting culture. But if you look at the history of it, you see it is an economic tool, or what Bourdieu would call a weapon of symbolic violence against what the real traditions of winemaking were, against the real heterogeneity of what winemaking once was. So now, if you go around the world, anywhere you'd go, and you see wine, whether it's now in China or even India, you'd see, more often than not, they're often using French varieties, like Merlot, like Cabernet Sauvignon, like Sauvignon Blanc. And it's for many of the reasons we talked about here. Okay? Thank you.